Dialectical behavior therapy was created in the 1980s by Marsha Linehan in Seattle, Washington.
Today, DBT is taught all over the world.
We're two therapists who believe everyone can benefit from DBT skills.
I'm Kate.
I'm Michelle.
And this is DBT and Me.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today because we know this episode was a little more delayed than we anticipated with getting to all of you since it didn't come out at the end of September like we thought. But today I'm really excited because I have a great special guest here with me. Unfortunately, it is just me without Kate today. Kate has had a lot of life transitions recently with getting a brand new puppy, and we decided to give her a little break from podcasting for the moment. And luckily I knew I wouldn't be alone today because Jesse's here with me, so I'm going to give him a chance to introduce himself in just a little bit. But before we get there, we have some new patrons to shout out, which I'm very excited for. So thank you, Sarah and Denise, for becoming recent patrons. If any of you listening want to become patrons and you're not already, you can find our Patreon link at patreon.com/dbtandme. You can also check out our Etsy shop to see the DBT themed merch stuff that we have. Etsy.com/shop/dbtandme. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, we welcome ratings and reviews to let us know how we're doing. And also, if you guys have questions after today, please send us an email at dbtandmepodcast@gmail.com. If there's anything that you're wondering about, we would love to hear from you there. And I think now at this point, Jesse, I'm going to turn it over to you because we're here today to talk all about TheraHive, which is the company that you're co-founder of. I'm so excited to hear everything about it today and just who you are and all the things. We have lots of great questions to get into, but where do you want to start with introducing yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely. I'm happy just to give the whole spiel. So I'm Jesse Finkelstein. I am a clinical psychologist. My pronouns are he, him. I am also a DBT therapist. I am a co-founder of TheraHive and also a instructor at Columbia, as well as a big fan of making DBT materials. That is my short introduction.
That is a great condensed introduction because I know there's so much contained behind each of those different things that you shared, but that really captures it in a nutshell. Yeah, and it became abundantly clear to me when I went on the TheraHive website for the first time, which is it's very impressive. I'm not just saying that. It truly is. I was looking at it again today before we started recording and just scrolling through and seeing like all the animations you guys have. Like on the homepage, it really is enticing and draws you in, but it's really clear also with looking at the website right away that there is that passion for creating like free, easily accessible DBT resources. So I'm going to start off with these two questions for every guest we have. The first question that I'll have you answer is, at what point did you first come across DBT? What drew you into it? What did you like about it when you first learned of what it was?
Okay, so I would say that I was probably somewhat aware of DBT when I went and did my post-bac in advance of graduate school. But I don't think I really knew what it was. I knew it was a type of CBT. And then when I went back to graduate school, I'll be honest, my understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy was that it was this sort of mechanistic, like, oh, just change your thoughts and you'll be good. It felt too mechanical to me. I came in sort of prejudiced against CBT. And my first year in graduate school, I was fortunate to work with my mentor, Dr. Shireen Rizvi, who was actually mentored by Marsha Linehan. And in addition to teaching us the foundations of CBT, she also introduced me to DBT. And it was through her that I learned about DBT. I joined her DBT clinic. She ran a training clinic at Rutgers where I studied it for graduate school. And she taught a foundations class and ran a research group out of that clinic. So that was my initial exposure. To your second question, like what drew me to DBT? I think there were a couple of things. I think one thing is, again, this was sort of my prejudiced understanding of a lot of therapy, but the way that people would talk about therapy, and as someone that has been in therapy, it always seemed like the onus of all my behaviors was on me in some way.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is whatever troubles I had, whatever suffering I experienced, it seemed to be housed inside of me. And what I initially really appreciated about DBT was the recognition that things happen in transaction with our environment. And that even the model of the biosocial theory that helps to explain emotion dysregulation and borderline personality disorder recognizes that emotion dysregulation happens in transaction with our environment. That who we are, how we behave, is not just some sort of innate dysfunction that exists inside ourselves, but actually in transaction with those around us, our culture, our society, our political environment. And so in that respect, DBT felt very holistic to me and feel like and Marcia talks about this in her book. I mean, she drew from so many different psychological orientations, including a lot of feminist psychology, with a real clear recognition that there are factors outside of our control that impact our lives. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just the fact that for you with CBT, it was one of those things where the idea behind, okay, if you change your thoughts, then that's just what you need to do. And that you were like, there's got to be more here. And that when you learned about DBT, it really brought in the both and of like, yes, you do need to change your thoughts. And this is not just you. There are all these other factors at play that like the dialectical part of DBT is really what did it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's so much richness from that dialect. Like there's a whole philosophy that guides how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, this dialectic between acceptance and change. I'd always had a mindfulness practice and a meditation practice. And so all of a sudden now I could draw from that experience for a host of reasons. I was like, oh, this is the therapy that speaks to me.
Yeah, I love that. The second question that we ask every guest, because again, both and, right? Amazing things about DBT, and also no therapy is perfect or without its flaws. For you personally, what is the thing that you love most about DBT? And if you could change anything about it, what would that be?
There are so many things I love about DBT. Okay, let me
Yeah, it's
let
a
me
big one.
focus
It's a
my
big
thought
question.
into one thing. I love the fact that it is an emotion focused treatment.
Mm.
That I think many of the sources of our suffering are efforts to avoid, numb, block, suppress unwanted emotion. And in doing so, we oftentimes engage in ineffective behaviors. We end up moving away from our values, from our goals. And I think one of the really powerful things about DBT is that it really demands a confrontation, a skillfulness in playing and being with one's emotions. And I love that. I love that. I think one of the things that I at times struggle with DBT, and I think there's a number of things that I struggle with. I mean, the acronyms aside,
Yep.
I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm for the treatment, and I think it's incredibly effective. And, no treatment thus far has proven to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's at times a tension between adherence and commitment to the treatment. And I'm thinking within the sort of practitioners of DBT, or the people who
Yeah.
deliver it, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
I wish it was clear to us what are the mechanisms of change in DBT. There are so many things in this sort of cauldron of DBT, this big pot, all these different types of
Yeah.
skills, phone coaching and comprehensive DBT, the different therapeutic stances that we take, that at times I think it's difficult to tease apart what is really allowing for effective change. And I
Mm-hmm.
wish we had a clearer understanding of that.
Mm-hmm.
I experience some frustration as a person that delivers DBT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's one other thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
I think sometimes DBT, like many types of therapy, in terms of the demands around diary card and how oftentimes the clinician is setting the agenda at the beginning, I do sometimes wonder about that power dynamic that takes place.
Mm.
I don't know if I quote unquote hate, but I wonder about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Like there's kind of these systemic issues within the DBT model
Mm-hmm.
that can come up sometimes for people who are actually the consumers of it. So, yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what you said there. And I also love for the thing that you said you love about DBT, that you touched on the fact that so much of DBT does come back to us being able to start with identifying and being in touch with our emotions. What emotion am I feeling? What is it telling me to do? That you just love that piece because so often, right? It's a DBT, it's dialectical behavior therapy. So I think, and it, as you already acknowledged, it really is so similar and stems from cognitive behavior therapy. So I think sometimes people really do put the emphasis on either the thoughts or the behaviors. But you are absolutely right that if we're leaving out the emotional piece, we're not doing DBT. We have to be looking at our emotions. That's so, so important.
I get very excited talking about these things, so please feel free to cut me off at any point. One of the exciting things that I learned I was sort of taught by a number of what you would call sort of radical behaviorists. And and I think that I've sort of become one in some respect, which essentially what that means is that as a behaviorist, I conceptualize that there are overt behaviors, like things that you can see me do.
Mm-hmm.
Like things that like I can do in my environment, go for a run, talking to you right now. And then there are covert behaviors, the thoughts that are going through my
Mm.
head and the emotions that I'm feeling. And the reason why I conceptualize those as all behaviors is because they all fall within the same principles of behaviorism, meaning they're all sort of conditioned by those same principles. It's been helpful for me to think about emotions as being related in that respect. It didn't really arrive for me when I came to college. I mean, came to graduate school, but I think it is helpful for folks to understand that emotional experiencing can at times be almost like a habit. Like I'm
Mm.
spending a lot of
Yeah.
time right now working with folks on rumination. And rumination for many folks is a habitual covert behavior. No different than, let's say, any other habit, picking your nails or like biting your teeth or biting your nails or picking, your teeth. And so
Yeah, yeah.
similarly, we can
Those
fall
little
into
things we all do. Yeah.
yeah, we can fall into similar both mental and emotional habits.
That's a great way to think of it. I think that is one of the things that we don't think about a lot is we do just tend to think of behaviors as the things that we can observe another person doing. But yes, absolutely. There's so much that's happening at all times in our internal emotional world, within our physical body. There's so many subtle things happening at all times that absolutely are behaviors, as you explained. It's just, yep, we don't always notice it. The people around us don't always notice it. So, yes, I'm going to really be taking that with me and carrying that forward whenever I do find myself talking about the B in DBT. This is really what we're talking about.
And I think a helpful example for folks who have experienced trauma, where all of a sudden they see something in their environment, and as if without thinking, they're flooded with emotion. And I think it
Mm-hmm.
can often feel like, what's wrong with me? What, like, and that process is what we call classical conditioning,
Yes.
where
Mm-hmm.
a stimulus gets paired with this response because of some other period of pairing. And so when, because of a traumatic experience, there becomes an association in the brain between some sort of cue in the environment and that emotion. And so it makes sense when, for instance, you, as someone who's experienced trauma, see something in your environment and all of a sudden emotion comes up, almost
Mm-hmm.
as if without thinking. So, again, the way that emotions function as behaviors, I think can be pretty validating for folks who feel at times like their emotions are just these things that happen to them. Like it doesn't make sense.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. All emotions have some kind of cause, even if we don't always know what it is. Yeah, exactly. Well, as we continue here, basically, I'll just kind of tell our listeners a little bit what this is going to be about as we start going with some of the questions here. As Jesse mentioned, he's the co founder of this company called TheraHive. We're going to be starting off this conversation with hearing more about the background of TheraHive and what it as a company offers, because Kate and I are so passionate about making sure that all of you listening have fantastic DBT resources that we love and back 100%, and TheraHive is one of them. But also, as this conversation continues, I think what you all are going to really hear and notice is that this is a larger conversation, not just about TheraHive as a company and a resource, but really about the importance of DBT accessibility. And so that's going to be coming up a lot in Jesse and I's conversation that we're about to get into today, I'm pretty sure, which is so important when we're talking about this work of DBT, because it's not accessible to a lot of people. And I know you guys are working to change that. So let's start here with what inspired the beginning of TheraHive. Like, take us back to where this idea came from.
So it just so happened that the idea sort of germinating distinct, like, so my two other partners, Roland and Alicia, who are partners in life. Alicia is a psychologist as well and runs a DBT clinic in California, in Marin. And her husband, who has a history, a background in technology, we were all both simultaneously having the same thought, which is, how do we make DBT skills more accessible? So prior to TheraHive, I had created a game called The Game of Real Life, and then I partnered with my mentor, Shireen Rizvi, on a research project creating DBT animated videos. And for those folks who are interested, you can go to youtube.com/dbt-ru. And these were short animated videos that helped to explain a number of DBT skills. In the process of doing that, I found it so heartening that we could convey so much information in these small bites. And I think the other thing that I was sort of contending with I have a background in design, was that as psychologists, we're great at creating interventions to help people, but we're not necessarily great at making those interventions things that people actually want to engage in, like making manuals and materials, like, even the DBT, the skills pages, they're not the friendliest things in the world. You don't necessarily want to take them home and curl up in a ball, maybe you want to curl up in a ball, but I don't know, curl up next to them while flipping through. And so I think when I just by chance met Roland and Alicia, and we were all on the same page, which was basically we were sort of had two agendas. One agenda is currently DBT is really inaccessible. We're dealing with a mental health crisis in this country. We know that DBT is effective for a number of disorders. We believe broadly that DBT are like our life living skills and ought to be available to as many people as possible. And finding a person that delivers comprehensive DBT and does so adherently is oftentimes impossible in some areas or financially impossible in many areas. And so one goal of ours was to help figure out how can we make DBT skills available to as many people as possible. And that means both geographically as well as financially. So that's one part of our goal. The other part of our goal is how do we communicate these skills and this immense amount of knowledge and information in a way that people want to engage with, where they're not overwhelmed by, they're not bored by, but they're actually excited to learn more. And that was sort of our two big missions: increase accessibility and increase desirability.
Yeah.
And that's how we sort of ended up developing TheraHive.
Yeah, that's amazing. Um, Before we get into more of what TheraHive offers, like what people can expect to find if they're like, okay, what happens if I join, or that kind of a thing. You mentioned that for you, a lot of this really started with, you said, the game of real life
Yes.
that you kind of came up with all on your own. Can you tell us a little more about that piece of things?
Yeah. So it was my first year in graduate school. I'd just been introduced to DBT. I had a background in design. And when I came to school for psychology, I was like, okay, like my design background's in the past. Like that was my old life. Now I'm a serious psychologist. And I remember my Dr. Rizvi telling me like, oh, is there a way that we can use some of your skills, or that you can use some of your skills to sort of develop or like help disseminate some of this information? And in the course of that, I had also received a residency actually at Kickstarter alongside my sister,
Oh,
who had some experience in game design. And in the process of all of that, I developed the game of real life through Kickstarter. It was very successful. And then from there, it was picked up by an imprint at Penguin Random House. And truly, like, I feel very lucky in the respect that I got a chance to sort of metabolize some of these skills and information through design. Like in the process of illustrating each skill and all this material, I got to learn the skills even more intimately. And it's something now that I've carried over when I work oftentimes with adolescents, where I will ask them to do that very thing. Where it's like, okay, like what is the most effective way for you to digest this material? Is it illustrating these things? And so I feel very, very fortunate in that respect. And oddly enough, I've developed a bit of a side career developing illustrated materials for a number of different psychologists now. So I feel like I get all these opportunities to learn all these other treatments that I wouldn't have otherwise have
yeah.
access to.
Yeah, it really is the blending of both of your backgrounds in what you're educated in. That's very cool. And it sounds like definitely not the way you saw it going when you initially started grad school. You're like, all right, graphic design behind me, just gonna be, as you put it, a serious psychologist. And nope, the universe had other plans for
Yeah, I
you.
mean, I look at myself now and I was like, I don't know how I ever thought I was going to be serious in any respect. But yes, somehow I was like, oh, now I'm going to be a serious person.
Nope, still you, which is
So,
great because you have something so unique to offer the world. It's really really awesome. So bringing it back to TheraHive a little bit.
yeah.
For our listeners, many of whom may have never heard of TheraHive, know nothing about it. I mean, what is the experience in terms of what TheraHive offers to people who are wanting to learn more about DBT and get started with you guys? Like, what can they expect?
So what we've done at TheraHive is we've sort of broken apart the skills learning process. For those folks, I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with DBT, but just as a quick refresher,
Mm-hmm.
there are like four
Yeah.
major components to comprehensive DBT. There's the individual therapy, there's the skills group, there's phone coaching, and then there's this thing called consult team, which is basically
Mm.
informally therapy for the therapist. So
Yeah.
there are many ways that you can access DBT. You can do comprehensive DBT. You can also do standalone DBT skills groups where you're just learning the skills. Oftentimes those are 2 hours long. Typically you do like a home practice review and then you learn a new skill. In an effort to increase both accessibility as well as adherence to the material, as well as just fun, what we decided to do was take the learning of the skill and allow users to access our platform and learn it at their own pace. So when you come to TheraHive, you sign up for one of our DBT skills groups, you start out sort of learning at your own pace a week's worth of skills. It's probably like 2 skills per week. And there are videos, there's text, there's fun little quizzes. We're introducing some cool other little interactive things that are coming up. They're animated videos. And so you're learning this material through all these different types of means. And then once a week, you join what we call our hives, which is a live group over Zoom, where each person talks about how they implemented or practiced those skills over the week for an hour. And it is one of the most heartening things to like. I think there's something really important and powerful about group of people meeting weekly and practicing skills together. I think that we live in a time in which there's a lot of loneliness and there's a lot of isolation, and there are not many opportunities to be vulnerable with others. There's also not a lot of opportunities for people to see how hard we're working and to recognize that. And there's also not a lot of opportunities to practice these fundamental skills. So the live component of what we do it feels very special to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Well, I'll just speak a little bit as somebody who, most of our listeners know my background a little bit, Kate and I's background together because we led groups for so many years as a duo. But it's exactly like what you're talking about. What we offer to clients was a 2-hour, once a week, standalone DBT group with the expectation that all of the participants in the group have an individual therapist of their own that they were meeting with. That didn't need to be a DBT therapist, it just needed to be a therapist of some kind so that they would have that extra level of support if needed beyond just what Kate and I were providing in the group. But here's what I like about what you just described with what TheraHive offers, because in most DBT groups, and this is true with Kate and I, if somebody had to miss group for some reason, well, then too bad. You missed out on learning that skill. So if, let's say, the skill we were teaching was check the facts, sorry, bummer, you didn't show up to check the facts night, you didn't get it. Now, you have your materials that we gave you at the beginning where it's like, okay, you can read the worksheets and sure, we'll try to, fill you in on it real quickly before the next group, but they would have basically missed out on that skill. Whereas when you have that self-paced component, people aren't missing out on the skills. They're learning everything. It's just on their own time. And I don't know, I had it a lot of times where, and to be honest, I felt this way sometimes as a clinician, but I could tell that our participants sometimes felt it too, where we would normally offer groups in the evenings, of course, outside the typical 9 to 5 work hours for people. But people show up. They're physically at group for 2 hours. Fantastic. But they're drained. They're there, but by week 6 out of 8, I feel like sometimes people are feeling a little burnt out from group, which I understand. But there's still that expectation that because you're joining this group, you have to be here for this 2-hour block every week. That's what you're signing up for, whether it's on Zoom or in person, you have to be here. So I really like that you are keeping that piece, which again I think is really powerful about DBT groups, where it's a it's a group of people saying I'm committed to doing my own work for my mental health, and you can build that community. And like Kay and I over the years have seen some really amazing connections come out of DBT groups. So it's great to have that community, but you're also making sure that people are learning skills in a way that I agree with you is much, much more accessible when it's self-paced and they can do it whenever it really works for them. If they have a day where they're, I don't know, sick or something, no big deal. Just like get to the skills in 2 days when you're feeling better, and then you can go to like watching your videos or whatever it is. So that's a pretty outstanding model that I really, really like.
I really appreciate that. I'm gonna, this is gonna sound, I have never thought about that part of like, yeah, when you miss a group, you kind of miss the skills for that week. And you're
Uh huh.
right. Like that is, you highlight a
Yep.
good point. I also to your point, like and you know, and maybe you can I speak to this as well as a skill like as a group skills instructor. Like 2 hours in the afternoon or
Mm-hmm.
evenings, it's a long time. And you can, I
Yep.
mean, you know, like studies show that folks have like a 45-minute to an hour window before they really lose attention. And so, I, what I will say is, unlike other experiences, teaching groups in the evenings where I've been like, oh, 2 hours, I never end any like hive group that I've led feeling drained. It is fascinating.
Hmm.
I've never left
Mm-hmm.
feeling like, oh, like I'm so happy that's over. I've always left being like, this is so fabulous. This is so much fun. Which I
Yeah,
really do think having it be an hour versus two is kind of significant in a way.
I agree. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm kind of wondering. I'm adding this in a little
Yeah,
bit
please.
because it was something that I noticed on the website. And while we're talking about the hive
Yes.
part and how this is really crucial, it mentions on your website that the hives are a small group. I think it says something like 6 to maybe 10 at most people, but what's the process of making sure that you're matching people who are going to be cohesive? Like, how are the hives formed? Is it based off of like when people are available with scheduling or geographically, or is it based off of other demographics like age groups, or how do you make the hives? How does that
That's
go?
a great question and something that we've been thinking a lot about. I think, you know, there are a couple of factors. Obviously, you know, time availability is a big one.
Mhm.
And then we're also conscious of we want to have a diversity of experiences and perspectives in groups so that people really feel like they're getting a lot from one another. And we're also mindful of that, like, you know, we've been thinking about like different age ranges and having groups based on like different like types of life experiences in that respect, or different types of affinity
Yeah.
groups. We haven't pursued that yet, but it's definitely top of mind as, you know, we continue to sort of like refine the group structure. I do think that there is, you know, I mean, I don't not to get on my soapbox, but like, I do feel like in many ways, and I say this as someone that lives in New York, it's like it's so easy to be isolated from other types of people, from other parts of the
Mhm.
country, or other parts of the world. And one of the really unique things about our groups is that at times they're both international and national. So you're seeing folks from like any number of states and seeing folks that you wouldn't otherwise have any connection to. And
Yeah.
that seems to me to be an important thing right now. I don't know.
Mhm. I agree with you. I think that is important. And, on the one hand, I can see an argument for like making sure that the group, I don't know, the word I'm thinking of is like a homogenous group, right?
Yeah.
Like a group of, say, like, I'm just thinking of myself, right? Like I'm a 35-year-old mom. maybe I would love to be in a hive with other moms, or that kind of a thing. I can see an argument for that, and I can also very much see what you're talking about of like, no, when you have a bunch of different people from all walks of life and all different backgrounds coming together, it really enriches the experience more because you're going to get different viewpoints or hear about how, I don't know, one person is using the skill in a totally different way or a totally different situation than you would, perhaps. And I just think, too, I think you find the sweet spot with the number of your groups. I mean, Kate and I have always said we don't really like groups going beyond 8 people. That feels like enough. We have led groups much larger than that, and it just gets too overwhelming. So I was happy to see like the numbers that you try to keep your hives to, because I'm like, that's a good number right there. I agree with that.
What you raised about like sort of like there's it's an interesting dialectical tension, because on the one hand there is, and I've been thinking a lot about, for instance, like as a gay man, like I've been thinking a lot about starting a queer LGBTQIA plus group.
Mm-hmm.
Insofar as, and this is sort of coming back to, I think, something that you sort of were commenting on at the beginning about like the benefits and it's sometimes the disadvantages of DBT. DBT was created, researched with a specific population of folks,
Mm-hmm.
namely cis white women. And so when Marcia was developing it, also who happened to be a cis white woman,
Yeah.
the cultural frame of reference impacted the skills and the way she talked about the skill. And I've seen really interesting additions to skills groups that recognize the experience of various types of groups. I've seen a queer DBT skills groups that fold in information around issues of traumatic invalidation, bullying, and harassment. And so, on the one hand, I can see a real benefit to sort of adding in and reframing some material that really speaks directly to people's experiences. And to your point as well, I think the tension is you also want to have a diversity of experiences as well. And I think we're sort of always playing between those things. And I don't have a clear answer. I just know I want both.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I think maybe both is the answer, right? Like maybe, I don't know. I'm just totally throwing this out there out of nowhere as we're having this conversation, but maybe it's something where people initially, when they might join a hive, like, okay, you're kind of thrown into like more of a general population type of hive with like a lot of different people. And then after you go through that experience, if you want to then also join a hive that is more niche, then you would have the opportunity to do so, perhaps. Like, I don't know. Maybe it could look that way.
We've been running some advanced DBT groups as well. And so, like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's a place for it as well.
Yeah.
I love that idea. I mean, obviously, I trust people's wise mind. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you feel like, you know, learning and talking about these skills is a very vulnerable thing. And an
Yeah, it is.
experience of, I feel like safety is overused and maybe not properly operationalized, but an environment in which you feel free to express yourself and be vulnerable is really critical. And I can see
Mm-hmm.
for some folks that means having a more shared language around,
Mm-hmm.
either, you know, racial identity or sexual identity or
Yeah.
gender. Like, I can see the benefit for that from that perspective, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, totally. No, it's definitely a thing to, I think, keep mulling over and keep developing. It's great that you are considering offering, more specialized hives like that. I think that's really awesome. Well, diving into a little bit more of the accessibility component, which we've already been touching on a little bit, but one of the things that I really liked when I first heard about you guys and I looked at your website and I scrolled through, and I will be honest, I did not click on any one thing because I was just scrolling. You have a bunch of free stuff on your website, tons of free resources that you guys have developed, which I love, right? I mean, Kate and I, of course, we put out this podcast for free because we want free DBT stuff out
Mm-hmm.
there in the world that anybody can access where cost is not going to be a barrier. Um, so with some of the free resources on your website, what are like a couple that really stand out, like that are your favorites or that you feel really proud of that you
Mm.
guys have out in the world? Because there's a lot of good stuff there.
Thank you. Yeah, similar to you. It's like, money seems to be perhaps the greatest gatekeeper, and it ought not to be when it comes to mental health. And that's maybe a conversation about insurance and all sorts of stuff that we don't have to get into. And to your point, yes, we try to like offer as many free resources as we can. Um, there are a couple of things that I really love. One, we have like a DBT pocket guide, which is like a short reference guide of the DBT skills. It's really easy and accessible. There are a number of animated videos. We have an animated video that we did on the dandelion story, which Marcia talks about in the manual, sort of describing what acceptance looks like. We're working on we did one on chain analysis and how a video like sort of showing what chain analysis is and the process of conducting a chain analysis. I think one of our goals is with these videos is to take complex topics in DBT, like dialectics, like chain analysis, and introduce them in a way that feels approachable and friendly. That's been like
Mm-hmm.
my big vision in doing some of these free resources. It's like, okay, for a lot of people, this might be a barrier or may feel intimidating to approach DBT. So I want to make this as approachable as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I love that word approachable. Because some of the words that like I think of, or also that start with A, right? I think of like affordability, accessibility, but approachability, which really speaks to that second goal you talked about that came out of forming TheraHive, which is like not only do we want to make DBT accessible, but we want to make it
Yes.
approachable, and that's a key thing that you're trying to highlight with the free resources that you have on the website. It isn't just like, oh, look, you can get this thing at no cost, like this pocket guide. Okay, that's cool. But what we really want is for you to look at this pocket guide and be like, oh, I want more of DBT. Um, yeah, I love that. Highlighting approachability. That's important.
I mean, fundamentally, whether you come to us or whether you get a DBT therapist, what have you, I think we just believe that DBT is really powerful and effective. And I think we
Mm-hmm.
kind of feel in some ways like mascots for DBT. And we just want to create material to be like, hey, here's this amazing thing that's going to help you reduce your suffering and move towards what's important to you. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's what we want to share.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Another question that I have is that we have a lot of listeners who are mental health providers.
Hmm.
So, people who are looking to learn more about DBT themselves so that they can better share it with their clients and that kind of a thing. People who are already leading groups or who want to lead groups someday or that kind of a thing. So, of course, I mean, you you met your co-founders and your three brains together and your skill set. You launched this really great website and company with TheraHive. But for the people out there who are maybe doing, like, I'm just thinking about like what Kate and what Kate honestly still does, right? Kate is still leading DBT groups. I've taken a step back the last few years, but the clinicians out there who are providing DBT in sort of the standard way that we know how to provide it. Like what ideas do you have for them, or what suggestions or tips for how they can make it? I guess those 3 A's: more affordable, accessible, and approachable. What would you suggest for them in these regards?
It's a really great question. And I struggle with this as also a clinician that has a practice outside of TheraHive. I think the accessibility thing is really challenging because we live in, not to mince words, but in a country that makes accessing affordable healthcare, let alone mental health care, really impossible.
Yeah.
And so, if you are a therapist, there are plenty of resources and advocacy that you can do that I highly recommend around, lobbying to increase access for mental health resources. I think it is hard to ask individual therapists to sometimes make those calculations because they too need to live and pay the bills.
Mm-hmm.
So the accessibility question is challenging to do as an individual therapist. I think the approachability feels much more hopeful for me. I
Mm-hmm.
think that, in DBT, as clinicians, we often think about concepts like speed and flow, and
Mm.
how one of our jobs is to maintain the interest and attention of the folks that we're working with, and at times even catch folks off guard. So there is an element to what we are doing that can sometimes feel almost like entertainment or improv. And so I think having as many materials and resources, whether it's videos, whether it's like YouTube videos that show, or TikTok videos that show DBT in action or skills in action. Like there's so much great, like people doing like real life implementation of DBT, or using or drawing examples from like sitcoms or what have you, where like they're showing DBT skills in practice, that again can allow people to connect with the skills rather than feel like they're just being sort of talked at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. The thing that came to mind for me as you were just sharing that is like one of the worst things I feel like that we can do as clinicians is turn into just lecturers, right? Like standing up in front of a whiteboard or being there on the screen if it's a virtual group over Zoom or what have you, and just talking, presenting the materials. Look at the handouts, blah, blah, blah. Because, like you said, the handouts are dry. I mean,
They just are.
they
They
are,
weren't they
yeah,
weren't
just by their
designed.
nature.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So bring in other media and other ways to learn and that kind of a thing. Yeah. I thought about, and again, I'm not necessarily suggesting that other people do this exact same thing. Kate actually had this idea. I think we were able to do it for one person. She had this idea a while ago. I'm just thinking about the affordability piece because it's like you said, therapists also need to pay bills and live. It's true. Um, but yeah, Kate came up with this idea of like a DBT scholarship fund
Mm.
where basically when participants would sign up, it was more or less just saying like, look, this is completely 100% optional. Also, if you have the means and if you want to basically contribute to somebody who needs help with getting into a DBT group and being able to afford it, if you're able to give anything extra on top of your registration fee, we use those extra funds to pay somebody's way to do group who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. Um, that was a thing that we were trying to do to sort of make it so that we could have like a pro bono spot
Yeah.
in ideally every DBT group that we would offer. That was something, and yeah, but it's so tough to find that balance of making it something that people can afford but also paying the bills. That piece is tough.
Yeah. At TheraHive, it isn't therapy. So there's greater
Mm-hmm.
flexibility in some respects around Well, like for instance, like we have a very reduced fee group where folks agree to recording for training purposes. So the idea is that they're
Mm.
part of a group and we're recording to help improve the quality of our coaches. And in exchange, they get a significantly reduced fee. I also the idea that you like the donation model as well is something that we've been thinking about introducing as well. I think whatever you can do to make
Mm-hmm.
it accessible for folks and be creative is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. 100%. Oh, kind of the last question that we have here, which is a big one. we might
Mhm.
we might spend some time on this one for sure. But really getting your take on what you think or what you hear about from participants with TheraHive of like what people's biggest hesitancy tends to be with getting started with DBT work. Because again, we have a lot of listeners
Mm,
who, they'll say this sometimes, like in our Facebook group, they're like, I'm self taught with DBT, right? I've never done a group. I didn't learn these skills from my therapist. Like, I went out and I found DBT by listening to this podcast, by reading books, by, accessing all the resources that are out there and do exist.
yeah,
But then they reach a point where they're like, I want to do a group or I want to start, working with a mental health professional in some capacity to get deeper into DBT. But, people face real roadblocks to that. Like, what do you think we can do to help people get past any hesitancy they have? And, again, just kind of that accessibility piece. How can we make it so that people can more easily get that formal DBT help if they're thinking about it?
I love that question. And I think there's two things that I've heard. And I think one thing is to your point, I think the idea of a group can be somewhat intimidating for folks.
Mm.
Being with people that you don't know and being vulnerable with them can be super scary. So I want to acknowledge the reality of that. I think the other end is that, like, as scary as it is one of the most powerful forms of connection that we can have. And
Mm-hmm.
so, my goal isn't necessarily, I don't do a lot of the intake conversations, but the way that I think about it and I talk about it with folks is like, if someone is hesitant to be part of a group, it makes sense. We can validate that. And there is something about learning from other people's experiences and connecting with others that is just so reinforcing. I mean, so there's a reason why you have so many group like, it's like communities are based on these, like on group dynamics. It's hard to go through things alone. I think the other thing that I hear is folks having a hesitancy about DBT around this idea of what it means to regulate one's emotions. It's interesting that for many folks, the idea of regulation can translate into suppression. I think the other place or the other comment that we sometimes see or hear from folks, or that I've heard from folks outside of even TheraHive, is concern around the idea of emotion regulation. I think sometimes emotion regulation could read to people as emotional suppression
Mm-hmm.
or somehow the communication that your emotions are invalid or inaccurate. And it's really important for me to highlight to folks that emotion regulation is, and DBT broadly, is in fact not about suppression. Our goal is not in no way about emotional suppression. What we mean by emotion regulation is that emotion, if we think about emotion as any type of behavior, it is sort of a wall of sound that we as the conductors want to create greater skill conducting towards our goals to this symphony.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean pushing your emotions away, although there is a skill called pushing away. Maybe sometimes it does mean that. But fundamentally, it means really accounting for your emotions, validating your emotions so that you're moving towards your goals.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
those are the two big
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, totally. That if people could understand that more and not have this misconception
Yeah.
about, yeah, the emotion regulation piece, that would probably make it a little more desirable. And that's such a good point of like that um, there can just be, I think, a lot of misinformation out there about DBT.
Yeah.
About like what mindfulness is. I mean, I can't even tell you how many people I come across where they think that, mindfulness means meditating. And that's one of the things that Kate and I
Yes.
say, and so early on is like, no, meditation is one way you can practice mindfulness, but you can do mindfulness anytime,
Yes.
anywhere with anything. And people are like, oh, well, I didn't know that, right? Being able to help
Yep.
people understand, like, no, we're not here to try to encourage you to suppress your emotions. We're here to
No.
give you tools so that you are actually better able to access what you're feeling and then feel in the
Mm-hmm.
driver's seat about what you do with it.
Yes.
And then that makes it so much more enticing when people can actually understand what they would be getting out of the DBT
Absolutely.
work. But I want to address too what you said about groups because, oh boy, like back when I was working in community mental health, and, we would lead DBT groups where we would have, I think we capped it at like 25 people could enroll, knowing that probably 5 of those people would never show, knowing that probably another 5 to 10 would wind up dropping out in the middle due to poor attendance or that kind of a thing. We would have pretty large groups, but I would want to refer some of my own clients to the group. And even when I would tell them, I'm like, look, I'll be there. Like I'm facilitating it. You know me. Like maybe that would help me feel more comfortable. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, just the whole thing of people being like, I don't want to be in a group of strangers that I don't know. Like, yeah, we do. We really need to, I think, speak to the benefits of group work. And also, I mean, like you said earlier, we don't want to overuse the word safety, but I think as providers, it really is talking about this is what we do to try to make the group like a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
these are the ground rules we have in place. This is how we would address certain situations. This is what we try to do so that it feels a little less scary.
Yes.
Because it does
Without a
feel
doubt.
scary.
Yeah, it does. Totally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, this is all really great stuff. I feel very thankful for this conversation that we had today because
So do I.
I really liked how you spoke about a lot of different things. I mean, even just there at the end, right? How emotion regulation is different than emotional suppression. Definitely going to take that and use that more. Because that's what we've been talking about all these years, but you just summarized it so succinctly. So you had a lot of great things to share.
Thank you.
Before we get to the closing moment for today, what sorts of things, I mean, obviously we want to know TheraHive's website, where people can find TheraHive, but are there any other things you want to promote as far as DBT resources go for our listeners? Anything you think would be helpful?
Sure. So, folks can go to TheraHive.com. You can visit me on my Instagram, which is um, Talk is Good. And you can visit my website at talkgood.org. And you can visit the videos I made with TRU and Dr. Shireen Rizvi at youtube.com/DBT-RU or DBT-RU.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so because Kate is not here today to do the closing moment, I am going to be leading the closing moment for today. So, when you're ready, you can all get settled in, getting into a comfortable position, and closing your eyes if you feel comfortable and able to do so. And today, a lot of what came up in this conversation with Jessie was about barriers that we face to things in our lives. Whether you're facing a barrier to getting more engaged with DBT, or whether you find yourself facing barriers with other areas of your life, with other goals that you have yet to get to, but you feel in your gut you really, really want. We're just going to spend a little bit of time today in the closing moment thinking about what it looks like to get closer to the goal that you have for yourself. And as we think about this, we're going to think about it in regards to the 3 A's that Jesse and I talked about today. Reflecting on affordability, accessibility, and approachability. So as you're reflecting, let's first think about if there are any financial barriers that have been blocking you to reaching this goal you have. Recognizing that financial barriers are not overcome easily, and also thinking about how you could get creative with your finances to see if you might be able to find an opening to make what you want a little more affordable. Inch you a little closer to being able to access it financially. And next, thinking about accessibility with this goal that you desire. Maybe you're struggling to make the time for it. Maybe it's a scheduling concern. Or maybe if it's something that you need to be physically present for, you find it difficult to get where you need to go. And just starting to think about what other resources or support systems you have in place that you can draw on that might help you with the accessibility part of your goal. Someone you can ask for help, a resource you haven't yet looked into that might give you a little more time or help you get to where you might physically need to be to make this goal happen. And finally, thinking about approachability. What makes it difficult for you to be in the mindset that you want to be in to really approach this goal and feel fired up about it? Really ready to make it happen. Sometimes even with things that we really want, we find ourselves shying away from approaching it because of mental blocks that we may have within ourselves. Thinking for yourself, what might need to shift within yourself to feel like you are emotionally and mentally ready to fully approach this goal, this thing that you want. And really imagine yourself being filled with that desire from the inside out. And as we bring this closing moment to an end for today, just checking in with your body to notice how you feel after thinking about these 3 different areas. Noticing if you feel a little more empowered and able to reach this goal that you have for yourself. And whenever you feel ready, you can open your eyes and bring yourself back to the room. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you again, Jesse, for being here.
Thank you so much.
To learn more about us and the DBT skills we're teaching each week, join our Facebook group. Simply log in to your Facebook profile and search for DBT and Me Podcast.